Today we're going to be looking at ancient civilizations and how they'll be covered on high school equivalency tests. So let's take a look at what we mean, first of all, when we say ancient civilizations. What does that term even mean? So ancient civilizations are any populations of people before what we would call a nation state exists. If you're not familiar with the term nation state, that's okay. For right now, think about it like a country or a very early idea of a country. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of these terms a little bit as we go forward. But this term describes different groups of peoples from across the whole world. And the GED is really not focused on you having a lot of facts memorized about these organizations or these different civilizations, but they want you to be able to identify how these civilizations change over time. So let's do some vocabulary really quick to get started so we all know what we're talking about. First of all, when we say the word nation, a nation is a country with defined borders and a shared culture. So that's what we mean when you hear the word nation. There are definite borders and a shared culture. Whereas a state is any area of land organized by the same laws or government. So you can have a state that is not a nation. We're also going to be talking a lot about migration. Migration is the movement of large numbers of people from one place to another. And then agriculture, the ability to grow food and store it over time. Now, the first place we have to look at is ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is going to get talked a lot about. If you look at my map here, this is of Europe, and all of the stuff that is shaded in like this was at one point part of the ancient Greek Empire. But Greece is actually located down in here, where my pointer is. So all of this was at one point controlled by Greece. And if we see here, this is the actual Greek Empire right here. Now, ancient Greece was not one single country. It was not one, it's not like the United States or England or Mexico. Instead, what we saw was the development of agriculture, that is the ability to grow and store food, allowed societies to form into towns and governments. Before this, it was very hard to get large groups of people able to live together in the same area. But once you could store large amounts of food and it wouldn't spoil, you could have a lot of people living together. These towns eventually grew larger into the first cities. And these cities started creating their own laws, their own society, their own rules. And so the first organizations that we see that really have what we would recognize as sets of laws are actually large cities, not countries. So these are sometimes referred to as city-states. And these city-states rise up in ancient Greece. And the different city-states of Greece were not all the same. They were separate from one another. But they did cooperate with one another for defense, for war, and for trade. Hi, Tylisha. How are you doing?
I'm okay. Good morning.
Good. So I was getting started and recording this, but I can jump back to the beginning and start over because you missed a couple slides if you want me to.
No, that's fine. You don't have to.
Okay. Well, this morning we're talking about ancient civilizations. So I was just talking a little bit about Greece here, so I won't go back to the beginning. I will show you just this map, though, really fast. This is where I was just talking about, ancient Greece. It's all this shaded in region right here.
Okay. So where is it shaded?
Yep. Yeah, this whole shaded in region was ancient Greece.
Okay.
And so Ancient Greece is not one country the way you'd think of a modern country. Instead, what had happened was the development of agriculture, that is, the ability to grow and store food that wouldn't go bad, had allowed towns to form up, and these towns grew into the cities that had their own laws. And so before we had the original countries, we had what we refer to as city-states. And each one of these cities has their own set of laws that they follow. So each city was really like its own little country. And the different cities of Greece cooperated with one another for different reasons. So for military defense or going to war, but also for trade, which was peaceful. One of these city-states is really important to modern American history, and that is Athens. And the reason that Athens is so important is because that is where the first democracy came. They invented the idea of having the people vote on what their government should look like. So if you see this show up on any high school equivalency test, those are some of the main things they're going to want you to know about from ancient Greece. So let's look at a test style question that might come up about this. Once a society developed agriculture and domesticated animals, food surpluses and rising populations made possible which of the following developments? Would it be A, a nomadic lifestyle, B, towns, C, stone tools, or D, stone carvings?
Um, um, B. Is it B?
B, towns. Good. Excellent.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. B is correct. Good. 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 Yeah, because being able to have and store food and domesticate animals allowed you to have these larger towns and cities that could have their own
Right.
rules. Yeah, a nomadic lifestyle, that like moving around a lot, and that would actually be harder once you started doing these things because then you'd have more stuff to carry around. Good, good, good. Good work. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Rome. You're very welcome. We're going to talk about Rome. Now, Rome was bigger than ancient Greece. All of the area that is shaded was at one point controlled by the Roman Empire. So it covered almost all of Europe and most of northern Africa, as well as large parts of the Middle East. Now, when we talk about Rome, it is based in Italy, in the city of Rome, in Italy. And Roman society spread not peacefully, but using a military. The Roman armies would spread out to a new country or a new area, and they would conquer the tribes or the people that lived in an area, and then they would impose Roman laws over that area. And they were very good at this. They had a very large army, and once your lands were captured, they would say, okay, now you have to have several of your people come and join our army. So their army would get bigger and stronger the more places they conquered. And so this allowed them to take control of almost all of Europe and northern Africa. Now, Rome, despite the fact that it uses its military to conquer these new lands, they do actually have aspects of what is called a representative democracy, which is similar to the democracy that we use in the United States. That is, you vote for a representative to represent your interests in the government. So in the state of Ohio, if you live in the Cleveland area, you either are voting for Capter or Fudge for your congressperson, and we have two senators, Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown. And you vote for them in different elections, or you vote against them if you don't like them, because you want them to represent your interests in American government. The Romans had a very similar system where people could vote for a representative to be their voice in the government. All of the representatives in Rome were called senators, which is probably a term you've heard used in our government. This is where that term comes from. It's the term that the Romans use to describe their elected officials. Now, Rome, unfortunately for them, does not stay stable forever. It lasted many hundreds of years, but eventually that system of elected officials broke down. And so they eventually become a dictatorship as the rulers of the government took more and more power. You've probably heard of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is the one that finally took total control over the Roman society. Now, this didn't immediately cause the entire empire to fall. Instead, what causes its destruction is corruption and violence throughout the empire. There's a lot of political corruption, bribery and money and all that make people trust the society less. And so over time, that all those laws that they had spent all that time building up start to not be effective anymore. So the Roman government lasted several hundred years, but it's going to collapse around the year 400. And after this, Europe, which had been controlled by Rome for hundreds of years, suddenly doesn't have a government anymore. And so it becomes very chaotic and unsafe. This is what you'll hear a lot of people refer to as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages after Rome falls. So this is an example here of a GED test question. They might give you a map that looks like this with all these lines crisscrossing along the Roman Empire. And they've got a question over here on the right. Based on the map, which of the following best describes trade activity of the Roman Empire? And here, the Roman Empire is all of the shaded part of the map. And all of these lines going back and forth, those are trade routes. So based on the map, which of the following best describes trade activity of the Roman Empire? Is it A, the Roman Empire was so large that only trade within the empire was required? B, the Romans preferred not to trade with people to the north and south of Rome? C, Romans only traded within their empire? Or D, Romans traded extensively, including outside their empire? So what I want to do is go through all four of these and ask myself, is each one true and false? So A, the Roman Empire was so large that only trade within the empire was required. Well, the Roman Empire does cover a lot of land here, but is there any trade that goes outside the empire? Again, the shaded region is the empire. The trade routes, all these lines, are going all around. But I see up here, the empire stops right up here, but the trade route goes into the next country over. It goes from Belgium to Germany, or it leaves what we would call Gaul or France and goes into Germany. We can also see trade routes leaving the empire over here in what's called Crimea, or by Armenia, or down here by Syria. The lines go in and out of the empire. So what we can see here is that trade went outside of the empire. It was not just within the empire. So right. A is probably not going to be correct. All right, so let's look at B here. The Romans preferred not to trade with people north and south of Rome. Well, first I have to find Rome. And Rome is going to be right here in the middle. So are they trading with people north and south?
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. So B, where it says they prefer not to trade with people north and south, that doesn't seem accurate to me, because when I look at this, it seems like they're doing a lot of trading up here in the north and a lot of trading down here in the south. So I don't think B works either. Let's take a look at C. The Romans only traded within their empire. Well, that sounds a lot like A, actually. It just doesn't have the thing that says that it's so large. So again, if I look, I can find examples of the trade routes trading outside of the empire. I can find the lines leaving the shaded region. Let's look at D. The Romans traded extensively. That means they traded a lot, including outside their empire. Well, there are a lot of trade routes here, right? There's a lot of lines going all across this map. That seems to me that they're doing a lot of trading, and some of it including outside their empire, and some of it goes outside their borders. So if I go through these systematically, A, B, C, and D, and just try to verify what's true and what's not true, that leads me to choose D as the correct answer.
Right.
Good. And then the next question here. Into which continents did the trade routes of the Roman Empire stretch? And for that, we need to know that up here, this is Europe. Asia is off here to the top right. And Africa is down at the bottom. So, into which continents did the trade routes of the Roman Empire stretch? Was it A, Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America? B, Europe, Asia, and Africa? C, Europe and Africa? Or D, Europe and Asia?
Europe and Asia.
Okay, so we have Europe here. Good, good, good. We have trade routes in Asia. Do we have any trade routes down here in Africa?
Yeah, because there's Egypt right there.
There's Egypt right there, absolutely.
So, okay, so is it B? So it's B.
It's
The
B,
answer is B.
exactly. Europe, Asia, and Africa, because it includes all three of those continents. Good. Good work.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's.
Praise.
Yeah. Now we have one more question here. Which is true about, or actually two more questions, I'm sorry. Which is true about Roman trade routes? A, Germany was not a trade destination. B, most trade occurred via the Atlantic Ocean. C, rivers were the primary form of waterway transport. Or D, most of trade occurred via the Mediterranean Sea. So let's just really quickly, Germany is up here. So when they're talking about Germany, that's up there. The Atlantic Ocean, that's off to the left here. And the Mediterranean Sea, that's in the middle of all these countries in the middle bottom here.
So it's B. So it's D.
It's D, good. Most trade occurred via the Mediterranean Sea. Look at all those trade routes crisscrossing there.
Yeah, and none of them really occurred where it says the Atlantic Ocean. Some
Yeah, we've
occurred.
got maybe,
Most of them
yeah,
occurred where. Okay.
exactly. Yeah, there's a couple up here, but not many. And down here we've got all of them, all these ones down there. Absolutely great. And then which of the following was most likely a consequence of the Roman trade routes? A, the trade routes caused the Romans to become increasingly isolated. B, the trade routes allowed Rome to enforce its laws throughout the world. C, the trade routes were the main cause of Roman economic collapse. Or D, the trade routes allowed for an exchange of cultural knowledge.
I think it's D because the economy collapsed because of the rioting with the citizens.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, it's the collapse comes from corruption and internal problems. Exactly. And the trade routes good allow cultural knowledge to spread from all of these different countries. And this is back when it was very hard to get from one place to another. So this was a really rare thing that the Romans had, all of these trade routes. Excellent work. All right, so now we want to talk just very briefly about what happens after the Roman government collapses. In Europe and parts of Asia, this is called the Middle Ages. And this is because you didn't really have the strong nation states or empires ruled by laws that you had before. Instead, you had governments ruled by a system called feudalism. And when you think about feudalism, this is where we talk about like kings and queens and knights and that sort of stuff. All the land was owned by a group of wealthy people. And so if you owned land, you had the title of lord. Yes, my lord. No, my lord. So if you have an apartment or you rent a house, who is the person who owns that called? They're called your landlords. This is where that term comes from.
Right.
The person who actually owns the land. And the people who live on the land paid taxes to that person in exchange for protection and the right to live there. So the lords protected their lands. What they did is they used some of those taxes to hire armies and soldiers, or knights and soldiers, I should say, to protect the people that lived on their land. But here's the thing. If you lived on that land, there wasn't a strict set of laws. So pretty much whatever your lord said, that's what happened. And if you had a good lord who was kind and had a sense of fairness, it was probably pretty nice. If you had a jerk for a lord who was really selfish or didn't treat people equally, then it was probably pretty terrible. And it varied from place to place and generation to generation. There were no countries, there was no central government to protect people. And the Catholic Church had a lot of power over people's lives. If you disagreed with the Catholic Church, they could make life very, very unpleasant for you. As an example, there's a famous scientist named Galileo, and he's famous for being the one to say that he thought the Earth spun around the sun, not that the sun revolved around the Earth. And he figured this out using a telescope and just mapping the direction that the stars moved. And said, it makes more sense that the Earth is probably moving around the sun. And for saying this, the church said,
Earth is moving around the sun.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And for saying this, the church didn't like that he was saying this because they thought if people learned this, that they would be less likely to believe in God. Effectively, because they had always taught that the Earth was the center of the universe and that everything went around Earth. And so when Galileo started teaching this, they basically cut him off from all of his friends and forced him to be locked in his house for 30 years. He was not allowed to leave. All because he believed something different than what they did. So again, the church had a lot of power to make people's lives miserable if you didn't agree with what they thought was true.
Right. That's why
so the Middle Ages are pretty. I'm sorry, say that again?
No, I'm saying, but that's why people should search and find out who God is for themselves instead of letting other people manipulate them into their own beliefs.
Well, yeah, and that's a thing that we value a lot in modern society is that people can look for their own knowledge and all that. And we value the idea that different people can disagree and have their own values, instead of having one value imposed on everybody.
Right. Like everybody has to be able to stand for something. The thing is, like, you want to serve the God that is real. You want to serve the God that actually answers prayers and protects you. A lot of churches and a lot of other religions, they don't really put into practice what they preach. Instead, they just like everybody else in the world, instead of standing on faith, because God is an unseen God. So instead of you believing that God is real, you go off of what you see instead of doing what God is telling you to do, which is believe him by faith, not by sight. So that's why it's important to know God's word and to know that he's the creator of the whole solar system, the universe, the planets, all the orbiters and stuff. So that way no one else won't try to trick you, and you'll see God work in your life enough to know that their religion isn't real, because their religion is not protecting them or saving them from wrath or from natural disasters or from being hungry or meeting their needs. Instead, they deprive people and manipulate people and murder people and use people to get what they need.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are definitely groups that do that sort of thing. And again,
Mm-hmm.
imagine living under a group like that, and that was your only choice, and you couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
If you tried to speak out against them, you would get in trouble for it.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that was the system that was going on back then, which is, I think, not a very good system. So that
No,
that lasted for a
it's definitely
while.
not a good system. It's definitely not a good system. But that's why the system
Yeah.
of Jesus is an unseen system. So if you live in a system that Jesus taught you to live, you can promote this system and putting his word into practice and letting his miracles work in your life enough for you to believe them, to pass it on to others. Like when you, like, if you have
Mhm.
like you walking with God, or you believe in Jesus Christ, you believe in the Holy Bible, there are things in the Bible that God tells you to use um to keep yourself maintained, wrapped up in him, so that you don't have to feel as if you need other religions, or you don't have to feel as if you need a group of people or a church or a different set of religion or beliefs to help you get what you need in this, in the American system, because the American system is ran off money, but God is ran off faith. So if you put in faith in God, you would show the American system how God has provided for you and has protected you, instead of people going against the authorities or the government asking for change. Instead, you should go to God and have faith and ask God for change, instead of allowing people to manipulate people. And that's just not for America. That's for everybody. That's for every country, any nation, any continent. Once you put faith in Christ, you can show people how God has worked for you in your life, instead of you allowing other people to manipulate you into their beliefs. That's the difference between actually knowing God, and having a different religion, is that God actually brings forth change. Christ actually brings forth change, but nobody allowed Christ to bring forth the change because their faith is so small. Like people say, you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. If you have faith in Christ as small as a mustard seed, you can change things. You can change the world. You can change the people. You can change the democracy if you have faith in God to know that this is actually what God wants me to do. So I feel like a lot of times in the Middle Ages, or today, present ages, or in Africa or in China, or when people feel like they being deprived, or being manipulated, used and abused by other leaders or other religions, they aren't going after the main religion to save them from different religions in life. You get what I'm saying? Like everybody say, oh, I go to church. Oh, I know God. I do this. I do that. But then you kind of think about it. Well, it's God. Did God say he's a God that's going to bring so much wrath and going to bring so much pain to your life? You feel as if that way because you're not actually putting into practice what God is telling you to do. But the other nations, the other religions have made their own laws instead of using God laws, and they are putting their practices and their laws and whatever, if it's demonic, or if it's something different than Christianity, or if they don't believe in the whole Trinity, they still are being obedient to something, you know and most people don't be
Well,
obedient. Why? So that's kind of like the difference. Like people say, oh, I didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice of being treated this way. I didn't have no other option. Well, that's really kind of not true, because you really didn't actually implement what the creator is telling you to do, the creator of humankind, the creator of the universe, the solar system, and things like that. Nobody puts into practice what the Christianity religion is telling them to do. Instead, they go and serve other things, and then people wonder why all this bad stuff happening to me. Is because you're not doing what your God told you to do. Instead, you have went after idols. Instead, you have went after other gods and things that please your flesh instead of your spirit. So, Chris, that's kind of really why the world is kind of messed up today, is because people don't actually want to have faith in Christ and know that he can bring them change. Instead, they try to make change themselves and taking their petition to the government or the president or higher prior powers or higher authorities in America or just around the world, period, instead of taking things to God.
Well,
I don't know if you believe in God.
well, it's I this lesson is more about the governmental aspects of it. So I'm not going to get into the theological. But what I think that is important about it is that, you know, it used to be that if you lived in a certain country, you were forced to follow a certain religion based on where you live. And like you're talking about, your personal faith is really important to you. And that's a valuable thing for people, is to be able to find that for themselves and to find what speaks to them. And again, that was actually something that was not common until the United States actually was one of the first countries to say, we're going to make a government that doesn't impose a religion on people, that allows people to make their own minds up and come to their own choices. So I think that's a very important distinction, that people can be able to find what's important to them spiritually. I think that's incredibly valuable. And again, what's kind of unfortunate about this in the Middle Ages, taking it back to what we were talking about a minute ago, is that they didn't have that. It was, this is what is imposed on you, and you will believe it no matter what. You're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to have doubts. You're not allowed to find it for yourself. It was somebody else telling you how you had to live, and you didn't have really much of a say in the matter. Which I don't think that's very good.
Yeah, and you know, and it sucks. It sucks to have people like that, because in our actuality, we really are all the same. You know, whether it's the Middle Ages or whether it's today, you know, we still are all humans. And no one deserves to be treated, you know, any kind of way, because if I cut you, Chris, and you cut me, we both gonna bleed red blood. We both got the same heart. We got, you know, we all the same. You know, skin color or hair texture, that shouldn't step in the way of someone's feelings or someone being treated other than a human.
Absolutely. Yeah, your worth as a person is not dependent upon that stuff, that superficial stuff. So okay. I agree 100%.
About this, because I never really got into social studies. I kind of really just took when I took the test, when I took the social studies test, I studied, and then I failed it. I failed it by a couple of points. So I just doubled back and I prayed about it and I passed it.
Well, I'm glad I think you have very good critical reasoning skills, Tylisha, because when we've been going through the passages, you're pretty good at spotting the correct information and the bad information when we go through them. So you've got pretty good critical reading skills, and I think you're pretty clever on that.
I be trying, Chris, because sometimes I be trying to test myself, you know, because sometimes you can just like sometimes I just know stuff. Like I already know things, but I still try to seek as much knowledge as I can. You know, like I already passed the social studies part of the test, but I'm here because it was by God's grace. It was by God's grace that I passed the test. So I'm sure there are things about social studies or history that I don't know, like things like this, like the Middle Ages. I can't remember if there was something about the Middle Ages on there, but it's interesting to me because you'll never know if I could have to teach it to someone else one day, or if I actually do have a test. Like you can never give yourself
Absolutely.
too much knowledge.
I 10,000% agree. 10,000%. With that being said, I'm looking at the clock here. If you don't mind, I am going to go on to the next slide and keep us going.
Okay.
What was that? I'm sorry.
No, I said okay. That's fine.
Oh, okay, great. Good. So the Middle Ages ends with something called the Renaissance. You might have heard the word Renaissance used. You might have heard somebody referred to as a Renaissance person or a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman, which means that they're very knowledgeable about culture. And that's because this period of time, known as the Renaissance, is when art and culture really started to recover. Art, science, and culture began to come back after the Middle Ages. And what you started seeing is people with common cultures began to bring themselves together. And this is where the first nations of the world come. So things like, when we talk about like France or Spain or Germany, a lot of these were just sort of regions before. They didn't have common laws and cultures. And so what happens during the Renaissance is these groups start to come together. And they form the nations and the countries that we know about today in modern Europe. So let's take just a really quick look at another question, another test style question. According to information that I gave you the same information that's on the page there. Two ancient civilizations that were particularly influential on the form of government adopted by the United States of America. Select the two civilizations that had the greatest impact on America's systems of law and government. So, what two civilizations did we talk about already that impacted American government?
I believe it's ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
Excellent. Yeah, Greece came up with the idea of democracy, and Rome had representatives in their democracy. Good. Perfect. Excellent work.
Thanks.
Now we're going to go to another part of the world. You're very welcome. We're going to go to another part of the world. We're going to go to China.
Okay.
And ancient China, this is the big region that's colored here. You can see this is the Pacific Ocean off to the right. You have Russia and Mongolia up to the north, and other parts of Asia, Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan are off to the left. But China is this big, brightly colored region in the middle here. China began similar to how Europe did, with a lot of those feudal territories, where you had someone who controlled a lot of land, and the people that lived there paid that person to protect them, and that person had laws and rules. And a lot of this society began to form along something called the Yellow River. I'm going to point back to it right here. If you look on the map, the Yellow River is this very long river that goes right through the center of ancient China, and it curves around. And most of the early society in China forms along that river. Power became collected as these cities and groups began to communicate with each other. They formed a central government run by someone called an emperor. And the emperors were sort of like the kings of Chinese civilization. They're the ones that made the rules, that controlled the armies, and they would pass on their power from parent to child, just like in kings leaving power to a prince or a princess. The emperor would give their status to their children. So these families of emperors became known as dynasties. And so if you ever heard that word dynasty, where it's like a powerful family, that's where it comes from these Chinese ruling families. The thing was that China kept itself very isolated from the outside world. They had been very threatened by other groups. And so they basically did not trust outsiders. And
I
so they
think
have developed a
they
lot
still
of
don't
knowledge.
trust. They still don't trust outsiders.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, that's something that goes back a very long time in Chinese culture, being distrustful of other groups. But what we have today is so much more open than what they used to be. It used to
Right,
be that if foreigners went there, they would not be allowed to leave. If you were somebody that just showed up in China, they'd say, "Great, you're here. You can never go home."
oh
um,
my
so for a
gosh.
long time, they guarded all of their internal knowledge very aggressively. Um, and so a lot of things were invented there. Things like paper, boat rudders, which I know that doesn't sound exciting, but a rudder on a boat allows you to steer your boat much more accurately than you can with a sail or with a paddle. And
Right.
so the Chinese had a very powerful ability to travel on water that other countries didn't. They also invent gunpowder and something fun, ice cream. So all these sort of innovations were coming out of China. They had all these sorts of different things, and for a long time it all just stayed there. Nobody outside in the outside world knew about it. And this all changes when an explorer from Europe convinces the Chinese to let him come and go. And this guy's name is Marco Polo. If you ever played that game as a kid in the
What did
pool,
he do?
Marco Polo.
What did he do?
He was the first. He convinced the Chinese to let him come and go to go into China and then go back to Europe.
Okay.
And this was a very dangerous journey, but what it allowed him to do is he would go to China and he would buy things like silk. Silk was only available in China. The only place in the whole world that knew how to make silk cloth was in China.
And this
And
is
so he
real
was able to
silk.
go back to, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you
Oh
can make
yeah,
silk in
because
other countries.
they wear the silk gowns.
Yeah, yeah. And so the silk comes from a worm that grows in China. So if other places want to make silk, a lot of times they have to get the little worms from China to make the silk.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
It's a little bug that spins. It's like how bees make honey. It's a little worm that makes strands.
okay.
Um, yeah. So Marco Polo went to China and he found all these really cool things like paper and silk and all these different things, and he took them back to Europe and said, "Look at all this cool stuff that they have there." And all the people of Europe said, "Oh man, we want that stuff." And so this started this very long trade route. Now, again, back then, they didn't have trains, they didn't have cars, they didn't have airplanes. So traveling to China meant walking thousands of miles. This was really tough. Marco Polo, he only was able to go back and forth from China about 3 or 4 times over his whole life. So this was not a trip that you could do easily. But it was something that started to happen. So this is what started happening. China is over here on the right side of the map, and Europe is way over here. This is where Rome and Europe had been. And what they started doing is making these long trade routes that would go for thousands of miles. This one down on the bottom goes over rivers and through canals and over water. The one on the top goes over land. But both of them are very, very long and very dangerous. But it allowed people to make a lot of money if they could get silk all the way from China to Europe. So this is what's known as the Silk Road, because it was literally a trade route or a trade route that you could trade things like silk and spice and all that you could not get anywhere else in the world. And the Silk Road is one of those things that's going to definitely show up if you take a test on world history. The Silk Road is a major topic that comes up. So let's look at a sample question that you might see on that. The Silk Road was not just one road. It was a series of ancient trade routes that stretched more than 4,000 miles from the Far East to the West. The
Ooh,
main
that's
overland
Cleveland and
route,
California.
yeah, yeah, I know, right? The main overland route extended from China to the Mediterranean Sea. Travelers on the Silk Road did not solely trade in silk. Traders from China in the Far East also exchanged ideas, philosophies, and culture with their counterparts traveling from the West. And so again, we have China over here, and we have these routes, and here's the Mediterranean and Europe up there. So let's actually look at what the question looks like. Why was the Silk Road important? A, it boosted the economy of Africa. B, it prevented the cultural exchange between the Far East and the West. C, it provided silk to wealthy Asians. Or D, it allowed goods and ideas to be exchanged between Asia and Europe.
I really want to say D.
D?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
I think
That's
it could
correct.
be.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yep, good. D is correct. Good.
Thanks.
And then how many goods from Alexandria have reached Kabul? And for that, we need to see where Kabul and Alexandria are. So Kabul is over here, and Alexandria is in Egypt right here.
Mm-hmm.
So how might goods from Alexandria have reached Kabul? Goods from Alexandria, how might they have gotten over here to Kabul? Via Rome and Constantinople? Via Seleucia and Bactria? Across the Great Wall of China? Or via Antioch and Samarkand? And I will tell you that the way that I solve a problem like this is I look at the map and I just trace for myself where is it going to go.
Oh,
and just try to match up the name.
It's C, because the Great Wall of China, is it going? Oh no, it doesn't go. It goes near
The Great
Alexandria.
Wall of China is over here.
Okay. I don't think I can get this one. I don't know what that is. Via Rome and Constantinople. I don't know what that is.
Constantinople. Yeah. So if you look, this is the city of Alexandria. That's Kabul. So how do you get from one to another? Well, I want to look along the trade routes, the lines that they have. So what places do I visit? Do I visit Constantinople? Constantinople is up here. If I want to go from here to here, am I going to go up there to Constantinople?
No.
No, that's going to take me the wrong way. So it's not going to be via Rome and Constantinople. They're up there. I don't need to go over there. How about via Seleucia and Bactria? Can we find those countries anywhere?
Yeah, they're right next to Kabul.
Yeah, Bactria is right next to Kabul. Yeah, look at that. And Seleucia is right over here.
Yeah, so it has to be B then.
B looks really good to me. And then I just want to jump and look at D, Antioch and Samarkand. All right, Antioch is up here, but Samarkand is actually past Kabul up here. So Antioch doesn't seem like a bad idea, but Samarkand is sort of taking me off the right path. So yeah, so the best answer is Seleucia and Bactria B. Good.
Okay.
All right. And then let's just look at this last question. How is it likely that traders from Rome reached the Silk Road? So if you're in Rome over here, this is Europe. We have the Mediterranean Sea. This is Africa. And the Silk Road really starts over here, the land route. Okay? So if you're living in Rome, you're way over here. how are you going to reach the Silk Road? Are you going to go by wagon, by horse, by foot, or by boat?
Mm. I want to say, mm, I want to say by, um, I want to say by foot.
Okay. Well, foot traffic is going to help you out in this part of the journey over here. But how am I going to get here from over there? This is the Mediterranean Sea.
Oh, by boat. Oh, right, the sea. So it's by
Yeah,
boat.
by boat. Yeah, the boat is going to be the first part that's going to get me to the beginning of the Silk Road. Is I'm going to go by boat. Good. Good, 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 good. All right. So we have one more civilization that we want to look at, and that is ancient Egypt. Okay.
Okay.
Now, ancient Egypt, the country of Egypt that we have today is much larger than ancient Egypt. If you look at ancient Egypt, it is the shaded part right here that sort of spreads out at the top like a flower almost. And what you'll notice is that it's all by these blue lines. Those blue lines are the Nile River and smaller rivers that break off of the Nile. Okay? Because if you think about Egypt, I don't know about you, but one of the first things when I think of Egypt, I think about sand.
Oh,
Sand
yeah.
dunes and deserts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the only place that you could really live in Egypt back then was by the rivers.
Right.
Because if you
By the
lived too
rivers.
far away, you know, there wasn't anything. It was you'd burn to death.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Egypt was the most powerful civilization in Africa. And as we just said, it formed along the banks of the Nile River. The water was not only good for the people to drink, it also was very good for the soil and allowed them to grow crops. So all of their farms would be right on the river. Now, the Egyptians had a government too, and we talked about how in Europe they called their leaders lords. In China, they called them emperors. In Egypt, they called their leaders pharaohs. And instead of dynasties like they had in China, their ruling government was called kingdoms. But it's the same basic idea where you'd have power going down from one generation of ruler to the next, from parent to child. Now, shortly before the year zero, Egypt is actually conquered by Rome. Remember, I talked about how Rome would go to all these different areas and they would take over. Well, that happened to Egypt. Egypt gets conquered by Rome, and they are ruled by Rome for about 400 years. And after Rome collapses, just like Europe, Egypt is sort of left by its own. So when Rome falls, Egypt tries to start its own kingdom again, but it doesn't really work out that well. And so their kingdom collapses. There's another empire that we're not going to talk about very much called the Byzantine Empire, but the Byzantines conquered Egypt for a while. And then the Ottoman Empire took over. So unfortunately for Egypt, what happened is once the Romans took over, they really never were able to get their independence for a very long time. For about 2,000 years, they were ruled over by other groups of people. And
That sounds about right.
It's very sad. It's unfortunate. It's a dark period in their history. And they were ruled by the Ottoman Empire until 1867, which is not that long ago. And they didn't become their own independent country fully in charge of themselves until 1922. So it hasn't even been 100 years since they became independent again. So that's Egypt, and that's sort of again, that's not really a lot of detail, but that's what you're going to see them talk about on high school equivalency tests, is that Egypt started off as this very powerful independent empire,
Oh,
but then really struggled to be controlled by other people for a long time.
right.
And I'm sorry, I said that was the last one, but I was wrong. I forgot to mention that we're going to talk about South America for a minute too.
Okay.
In South America, before the Europeans came over, before Christopher Columbus and all those people, most of America that we think about was ruled by small groups, small tribal groups. But there were some larger societies, but most of the larger societies were in South America, or what we would call Mexico and South America. So if you look here, I've shaded in the areas that had these larger civilizations back then. And again, it's mostly to the south, not where we live further north. There are three major civilizations in South America before the Europeans come over. The Mayans, who were focused on science, astronomy, and culture. The Mayans really focused a lot on science, actually. So when we look to Native American history, the Mayans had done a lot to figure out how old the Earth was, and calendars and patterns like that. They were very good at that sort of stuff. You might have heard some people talk about the year 2012 as being like the end of the world. The reason that became a thing was because that's where the Mayans calendar stopped. The Mayans just counted all these years into the future, and they just stopped at what would be the year 2012. And so a lot of people kind of focus on, well, why did they stop then? The Incas was another group. They had a very sophisticated government that was based on laws, and that's really their culture. It was a very strong government with a very strong set of laws. And then the Aztecs are famous for developing a written language, which the other two used symbols, but they didn't use a written language with letters the way that we think of letters. The Mayans and the Incas used a different type of language that relied more on pictures and images.
Right.
Now, North America at this time, like I said, doesn't really have a major large civilization like these three. North America is more broken into smaller groups called tribes that are independent from one another. And each of these different tribes had their own set of rules and their own set of laws. But they were much more spread out, and they didn't really have a shared identity with one another. What ends the ancient American civilizations? It is Columbus and the Europeans coming over in the late 1400s and early 1500s. And the biggest problem that Columbus and the Europeans bring is diseases. They didn't understand how sicknesses spread. So we now know all about germs, but they didn't understand germs at all. And so very quickly, millions and millions of Native Americans start dying of diseases that the Europeans bring over. And the Europeans did not mean to bring them over, but the result of this exchange is that millions and millions of people died, which is pretty horrible. And the Europeans were not the friendliest people when they came over. They were trying to find ways to get more land and to get more territory. So when a lot of the Native Americans died, the Europeans would say, "Oh, well, you're not using that land anymore, so we'll take some of it." And that's going to start a process that's going to lead to the colonization of America, which there are, sadly, a lot of really negative things that come along with that. But the Americas get divided into different colonies by the European countries that come over. And again, they're taking advantage of the fact that a lot of the Native Americans are struggling with the diseases that have come over. So let's look at a test question that looks at this. Which of the following Central American civilizations is particularly noted for achievements in math and astronomy? So let's just take a look back. Which one is noted for math or astronomy?
Mayans.
The Mayans. Yeah. So here they call it the Maya civilization. Good. And that is pretty much it.